Dear students, I am going to discuss about the public debt and its burden. All of you know, like individuals, every government has to borrow when its expenditure exceeds its revenue. Public debt is a source of revenue, but it is different from taxes. It is not like taxes, it is different from taxes. What is public debt? It refers to loan raised by the government within the country or the outside the country. Now there are two types of, all of you know, there are two types of public debt, that is there are two sources of public debt. One is internal public debt and another is the external public debt. So what is internal public debt? When the government takes loans or borrows money from internal sources like banks and other individuals within the domestic territory of the country, then it is known as the internal public debt. On the other hand, what is external public debt? External public debt means that is when the government will borrow money from external sources, that is outside the country, from bank and other individuals and some private sources, then it is known as external public debt. Now with public debt, there is, in case of public debt, there is liability, that is the government have to repay the loan on time. So the burden of public, there is a burden in public debt. So what is meant by burden of public debt? It refers to the sacrifice and effects on the community through a rise in taxation at the time of repayment and for paying the annual interest on the government loans. That is, to repay the public debt, the government will impose taxes on the people of the country, and the people have to reduce their consumption expenditure. They have to make different types of sacrifices. These sacrifices or the burdens beared by the people are known as the burden of public debt. Now, kinds of public debt burden. There are mainly two burden of public debt. One is internal public debt burden and another is external public debt. Internal public debt burden means that is the public debt burden which is raised due to taking loans from the internal sources. There are four types of internal public debt burden. One is direct money burden, another is indirect money burden, another is direct real burden and indirect real burden. Similarly, in case of external public debt also, there are four types of burden: direct money burden, indirect money burden, direct real burden and indirect real burden. Now, internal public debt. It merely transfers the purchasing power from one person to another, because in case of internal public debt, the government will take loans from the internal sources, from the people or from organizations or from group of individuals within the country. So there is transfer of resources from the, that is the government will take loans from the creditors of the domestic country, and when to repay the loans, the government will impose taxes on the people. Now, imposing taxes, the government will collect money, and with this money, the government will repay the loans of the internal source. That is, there is transfer of money from the tax, from the group of people, one group of people, that is the taxpayers, to the that is the lenders within the domestic territory. So there is no outflow of money in case of internal public debt. Now, we cannot say that there is no burden in case of internal public debt. There are certain types of burden. We can analyze it as direct money burden. First of all, what is direct money burden? When the government will impose taxes on the people to repay loans of internal sources, then there would be sacrifices made by the people, which is equal to the amount of goods and services sacrificed by the people due to rise in taxes. That is, the direct money burden is equal to the amount of goods and services sacrificed by the people of the domestic territory due to rise in taxes by the government to repay loans of the people of internal sources. Thus, there is transfer. So, this burden cannot be said as burden, because already I have told you that there is only transfer of purchasing power from taxpayers to the lenders of the domestic territory. So there is only transfer of purchasing power, there is no outflow of money. So it is said that in case of internal public debt, there is no direct money burden. Now the indirect money burden. What indirect money burden means? Government loan if spent on development projects, then what happens? The demand for goods and services rises. That means when the government will spend money, the government will collect money through internal sources, internal loans, and spend this money on developmental projects, for example constructing bridges, highways and etc., then there would be demand for different goods and services to the government. It will raise burden on the society because the prices of these goods and services will increase. The government is not spending the loans for increasing the production of the economy. Instead, the government is spending money for the construction of road, bridges, etc. These are definitely essential, but not it will not directly help to increase income of the people. So there is a burden on the people. Now, if taxes are imposed for repayment of loans, suppose the government impose taxes on the people of the domestic territory to repay loans, then what will happen? It will affect level of production, because the people's desire to work, save and ability to work will reduce, because they are doing hard works, but the government is imposing taxes on them to repay their governmental loans. So the desire of the people to work, save and to produce more and to do hard work will definitely reduce. These burdens are known as indirect money burden. That means in case of internal public debt, there is indirect money burden. Another is direct real burden. Direct real burden means what? When the government when the government will borrow loans. From whom the government will borrow loans? The government will borrow loans from the prosperous creditors or prosperous or rich people within the domestic territory or from internal sources. Now the government have to repay the loans, and for repaying these loans, the government will impose taxes, including both the rich and the poor people. That means the government within the domestic territory or within internal sources, the government will borrow from the prosperous creditors, and the government have to repay these loans of the prosperous creditors by imposing taxes both on rich and the poor people. Now for repaying this loan, the government will have to collect resources. How the government will collect resources? The government will collect resources through imposing taxes. When the government impose taxes on the poor people, what will happen? That then the income of the poor people will reduce. And when the government will repay the loan of the prosperous class by imposing taxes on the poor people, then there would be increased income of the prosperous class, but the income of the poor people will reduce. What will happen then? There is a economic disparity, inequality of income between the rich and the poor people, and it will reduce the economic welfare, which is not favor of national interest. So this is a direct real burden of internal public debt. Another is indirect real burden. In case of internal public debt, there is also indirect real burden. When government imposes additional taxes on common people in the form of indirect taxes, all of you know indirect taxes like license fees and other stamp duties, etc. This way, when the government will increase these indirect taxes on the common people, then the common people have to suffer. By imposing these indirect taxes, now the government will collect revenue, and this revenue will be used to pay loans of the prosperous class, repayment of loans of the prosperous class. This way also the economic disparities between rich and poor people will increase. It will again discourage the people to work hard and save more, which will have an impact on production level also. So this is the not directly but indirectly through imposing taxes, the government is imposing some burden. Government impose some burden on the common people. So it is the indirect real burden. Now from this we come to the conclusion that yes, internal public debt is not significant. The burden of internal public debt is not significant, as it will not reduce the national income of the economy, because there is only transfer of resources from one group of people to the another. One group is taxpayers, another group is the creditors or the lenders. But we cannot ignore that internal public debt is totally burdenless. It has burden like indirect money burden, indirect real burden, and direct real burden. That is, although internal public debt has no direct money burden, but it has indirect money burden, indirect real burden, and direct real burden. Now we will move to the burden of external public debt. So external public debt means it is taken from outside the country, from external sources. When the government will take loans from the external sources, it is the liability of the government to repay the loans in time with interest. Now, in case of external public debt also, there is direct money burden. To pay loan and interest on it, a large amount of money has to be paid by the debtor nation. Suppose India is taking loans from USA, India is the debtor nation and USA is the creditor nation. Now the India has to repay loans to USA in a large amount with interest, principal amount plus interest. Now India has to repay the money, repay the loan to US in terms of foreign exchange, in terms of dollar, not in terms of rupees. For this, what happens? India have to export goods and services from India to USA without collecting any, without expecting any money from US. It is an unrequired export. Without money have to be undertaken by the debtor nation. That is, without money, on India only have to export goods to US because India have to repay debt to US, and India is paying this debt and its interest to US in terms of exporting goods and services. So definitely it is a burden, money burden on the people of the Indian economy. So this is a direct money burden of external public debt. Another is indirect money burden. Paying interest in terms of export reduces what? The domestic supply of goods and services. In case of India, the India is exporting goods to USA to pay their debt burden, to pay their loan burden, and as well as their interest. As a result, when India is exporting this unrequired when India is adopting this unrequired export, what will happen? The goods and services in India will reduce. That is, the domestic supply in India will reduce. As the supply will reduce, the price of the product in the domestic quantities in India will increase. So the people have to purchase the commodities at higher prices. So this is a loss of national welfare. So this is termed as indirect money burden. Another is direct real burden. The debtor government, for example, USA, imposes new taxes on the people to pay off the external the debtor government, for example, that is India, imposes new taxes on the people to pay off the external debt. That is, Indian government have to repay the loans of US. India is the debtor country. Now India to repay the external loan, now Indian government is imposing some new taxes on the people of Indian economy. Now this burden, when the government will impose taxes, this burden will fall more on the weaker sections of the society. By imposing new taxes, it is a burden. All of you know tax is a burden. Now the weaker section of the society will feel more burden. And as well as there's the government have liability, or the government is imposing taxes on the people, government have to repay external loan and its interest of external debt, as well as what happens, the weaker sections of the society of Indian economy will be deprived of certain benefits. Okay, they would be deprived of certain benefits like some facilities, subsidies, etc. So this is a direct real burden. Now indirect real burden, imposition of heavy taxes to pay external debt adversely affects willingness and ability to work and save. Definitely, when suppose the producers in India are working very hard, the government is imposing additional taxes to these producers like excise duties, GSTs, etc. to these people. As a result, what will happen? The producers' interest to produce more, to do hard work will definitely reduce. Thus, it will adversely impact the level of production. So, on the other hand, what happens? When government have the liability to pay loans of the foreign countries, the government's capacity to use resources for productive channels of the economy, for productive purposes of the economy will definitely reduce. That is, public expenditure on productive channel will reduce. All these will have a negative impact on the welfare of the people of the debtor country. That is, in case of India, the Indian people will suffer. So, from this, we come to the conclusion that both internal and external public debt raise burden. Internal public debt have no money burden, direct money burden, but it has indirect money burden, direct and indirect real burden. External public debt has all type of burden: direct money burden, real burden, indirect money burden, indirect real burden. Both internal and external public debt raise burden, but the burden of external public debt is higher than internal public debt. External public debt is uncertain. Suppose we are approaching to USA for debt, but it is not certain. It depends on our political relations, economic relations, and lots of other factors. So external public debt is uncertain, but internal public debt is certain. On the other hand, in case of external public debt, sometimes the debtor country, for example India, may enter into a debt trap. That is, it is a trap or it is a net under which the Indian economy may have to fall. What happens? Suppose to repay the loan of external public debt, the Indian economy have to raise another loan from another country. Okay, to repay the loan of USA, we need foreign resource exchange. Now, to repay this loan, the Indian economy is taking another loan from another country or from USA. Now, to repay this loan, second loan on time, the Indian economy is taking another loan from again USA or from another country. This way, the economy may enter into a debt trap. Okay, always the economy will be enter into a debt which have a long run impact on the economic development of the country. External public debt may attack the sovereignty of the country. Sometimes the creditor country, for example USA, may impose or direct on internal policy of the debtor country, because we are the borrower from the foreign country, we are borrower from the USA or Japan, etc. Now we must have to obey the rules and regulations imposed by the foreign countries on our economic policy. Sometimes it may happen. So excessive dependence on external public debt is not desirable. So it is necessary that when the government will decide to take loans or borrow money from internal and external sources, the government have to think properly, because in case of external public debt, there is larger and larger burden as compared to the internal public debt. So there is need of utmost care in borrowing from external sources. So ultimately, we can conclude that both internal and external public debt raise burden, but the burden of external public debt is much higher than the internal public debt. But from this we cannot say that internal public debt has no burden. Internal public debt also has burden. It also have burden, but the burden of internal public debt is lesser, while the burden of external public debt is much higher than internal public debt. Okay, thank you.